So hello everyone and welcome to our webinar series on health, well-being and literature. Today's speaker is Dr. Sophie Franklin. She's a researcher currently based in Germany. Most recently, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tübingen. And in April, she's joining the University of Stuttgart as a lecturer. Her first monograph, Violence and the Brontes, Language, Reception, Afterlives, is on the contract with Edinburgh University Press and due for publication in 2024. She is also the author of Charlotte Bronte Revisited, A View from the 21st Century, and her work has been published in Bronte Studies, New Victorian Studies, and the Journal of Victorian Culture. Sophie's current project explores narratives of violence, health, and contagion in the 19th century, and today she will be talking about the discourteous proximity between intimate violence and disease in a selection of Victorian women's writings. So the title of her talk today is Intimate Violence and Disease in 19th Century Women's Writing. It's all yours, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Aria. Let me share my screen. I have to do the advanced portion thing. Oh, that's not what you want to see. Oh, let's see. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Aria. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. It's really great to be here and have the opportunity to talk about some work in progress of mine. A quick content warning just before we start. As the title suggests, I will be talking about intimate violence with reference to physical assault, rape, and emotional abuse in this talk. And I just wanted to flag that up from the beginning so you know what is to come. Okay. So in mid-April 2020, when the first lockdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic were first in effect across numerous countries, Amanda Taub wrote in the New York Times that the world should, quote, add another public health crisis to the toll of the new coronavirus. Mounting data suggests that domestic abuse is acting like an opportunistic infection, flourishing in the conditions created by the pandemic, unquote. Taub's language suggests passivity. Domestic violence takes on a life of its own, seemingly infecting the perpetrator and diminishing their responsibility. And in her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, which addresses widespread violence against Native American women, Sarah Deer argues that using words such as disease or epidemic in the context of abuse, quote, deflects the responsibility because it fails to acknowledge the agency of the perpetrators and those who allow the problem to continue, unquote. Yet Taub's language also aligns her with many critics, scientists, and organizations, increasingly positioning violence as a public health concern that can be, perhaps, treated like a disease. In 2002, for example, the World Health Organization published their World Report on Violence and Health, which argued that violence was preventable and constituted a major health burden. In 2013, the founder of the Cure Violence Project, which began in Chicago in 2000, declared that it is, quote, contagious. That is, violence is spread from one person to another. I think there's someone's microphone on.
30. Would that work? Let me know. Great.
Okay. And in 2019, the UK government announced £35 million of funding for 18 violence reduction units across England and Wales, which seek to reduce violence through a public health approach. And that involves, as a House of Commons Library blog post notes, treating violence like an infectious disease. And it's worth briefly noting here that in this talk, my main focus is on an English context, UK context. Throughout the 19th century, physicians and psychiatrists increasingly explored the implications of violent criminality as pathological, with Thomas Mayo in 1838 positioning brutality as a disease of the mind, and Henry Maudsley writing later in 1873 that crime was, quote, the physical result of physiological laws of production and evolution, rather than an evil impulse or a vicious passion, unquote. And this was occurring amidst ongoing debate surrounding approaches to disease more broadly. So as Kirsty Blair writes, From the 1820s to the 1860s, anti-contagionism, which emphasized environmental factors in the cause of disease, particularly atmospheric influences or contamination from dirt and waste, had largely prevailed. Anti-contagionism was a political as well as a medical issue because support for public health measures such as sanitation, education and hygiene, new systems of sewage and water distribution was perceived as dependent on proof that disease was not contagious. And such an approach placed some emphasis, or at least more emphasis, on personal responsibility and moral duty. However, by the 1870s, contagionism became the more accepted approach in light of germ theory, in which the transmissibility of disease was acknowledged. The advancement of the contagionist approach complicated further notions of individual responsibility, chiming with Maudsley's assessment of criminality. Newspapers were also referring to violence explicitly as contagious in the period, particularly in the context of political uprising, and especially when in reference to working class communities, from whom it was believed violence often stemmed. Working class people's perceived proximity to so-called animalistic states meant they were frequently associated with crime and brutality in a way that middle and upper class people were not. And here I have some examples from a few newspaper articles I found. So from 1863, violence is contagious. And then here from 1842, this is from a letter from a correspondent in London writing to an Irish Northern Standard. Popular violence is contagious. The excitement of one mass inflames another. And then here from 1871, the Ashton reporter reprints an article from the Manchester Guardian saying, violence is wonderfully contagious. And so this emphasis on locating violence and criminality with discourses of pathology and disease on the one hand, and the overt statements of violence being contagious that we see here on the other, are paralleled by literary treatments of the theme as well. And representations of domestic abuse were no different. While in this talk, I'm not seeking simply to equate modern articulations of violence as a disease with 19th century representations of violence as contagious, I am interested in tracing earlier formulations of violence as a matter of health in order to establish a clearer historicization of this phenomenon. And today I'm turning my attention specifically to intimate violence, which Suzanne Rintoul in her monograph on intimate violence and Victorian print culture defines as, quote, physical and emotional brutality in marriage, courtship, or sexual relationships, unquote. In the following sources, namely a letter by Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot's short story Janet's Repentance, and Frances Power Cobb's Wife Torture in England, certain terminology points to the discursive proximity between disease and intimate violence in the 19th century. And these sources also show how the imagery of disease is used to reflect the physical and emotional impact of brutality on both the abuser and the victim survivor, indicating a slight divergence from modern day conceptualizations, which predominantly position perpetrators of violence as the ones requiring kind of treatment rather than victim survivors. And this subtle shift, I argue, raises questions surrounding agency and responsibility in relation to violence as well as disease, under debate throughout the 19th century and indeed still today. So to turn to my first source, in a letter to her close friend Ellen Nussey, dated, we think, the 4th of April, 1847, Charlotte Bronte relates an encounter at the Haworth parsonage with Mrs. Collins, who had been married to the Reverend John Collins, curate at Keighley from 1840 to 1846. And Keighley is about an hour's walk from Haworth, so in 19th century standards, quite close. And I'll read this whole quote as well. Do you remember my telling you, or did I ever tell you, about that wretched and most criminal Mr. Collins, after running an infamous career of vice both in England and France, abandoning his wife to disease and total destitution in Manchester, with 2 children and without a farthing in a strange lodging house? Yesterday evening, Martha came upstairs to say that a woman, rather ladylike, as she said, wished to speak to me in the kitchen. I went down. There stood Mrs. Collins, pale and worn, but still interesting looking and cleanly and neatly dressed, as was her little girl who was with her. I kissed her heartily. I could almost have cried to see her, for I had pitied her with my whole soul. when I heard of her undeserved sufferings, agonies, and physical degradation. She took tea with us, stayed about 2 hours, and entered frankly into the narrative of her appalling distresses. Her constitution has triumphed over the hideous disease, and her excellent sense, her activity and perseverance have enabled her to regain a decent position in society and to procure a respectable maintenance for herself and her children. So in veiled terms characteristic of 19th century articulations of intimate violence here, Bronte refers to the undeserved sufferings, agonies, and physical degradation experienced by Mrs. Collins. She has escaped, and notably her constitution triumphed over the hideous disease, which her husband presumably gave to her. And so we have here the reference in the first paragraph to disease, of course, provides us with some kind of context or information relating to the later hideous disease down here, over which Mrs. Collins has triumphed in these kind of victorious terms. The disease is presumably one of physical illness, most likely, as Juliet Barker writes, a venereal disease, and as John Ford-Rescher posits, quote, almost certainly syphilis forced on her by her husband, unquote. Even in Ford-Rescher's remark, which is speculative, we don't actually know that she had syphilis or exactly what this disease is, but we can guess, there is still this implication of violence. And this is further complicated by the legal reality for married women in the period that upon marriage, they legally speaking consented to certain forms of abuse, or at least this is what the law kind of argued. And indeed, as Heather Nelson points out in an article on consensual marital abuse in Victorian literature, including George Eliot's Janet's Repentance, quote, the law recognized wives' allegations as cruelty only if their long-term physical health were affected because of their husband's repeatedly violent physical attacks, unquote. So here again, this kind of proximity between violence and health emerges. Other critics have also pointed to the possibility of Mr. Collins's alcoholism as another source of disease. For example, Josephine McDonough in the Oxford University Press edition of Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Waffle Hall links the abuse to intemperance and writes of Mrs. Collins's experiences as a possible inspiration for the novel. And indeed, Mrs. Collins is often invoked as a primary source for Anne's text, which examines marital abuse and emotional violence. McDonough refers to Thomas Trotter, whose essay on drunkenness, published in 1804, explicitly considers, quote, drunkenness, strictly speaking, to be a disease, unquote. Trotter defines the disease of drunkenness as, and I have the quote here, imbecility of intellect, erroneous judgment, violent emotions, and loss of sense and motion after the immoderate use of vinous liqueurs. Here, Trotter highlights violent emotions, but does not indicate a connection between drunkenness and physical violence per se, or indeed that the drunk individual is emotionally abusive towards another individual. Trotter goes on to write that, and I have the quote here again, the deceitful bowl of alcohol carries in its draught every degree of sensation from pleasure to pain, from the purest perceptions of intellect to the last confusion of thought, which raises man above the sphere of mortals, excuse me, and ends by bringing him to a level with brutes. Of course, not all disease is contagious. And as mentioned, Bronte was writing at a time when anti-contagionist approaches dominated understandings of disease. Yet Trotter writes that while most other instances of casual or sudden death have obtained rules for recovery, the drunkard exposed in the streets and highway or stretched in the kennel has been allowed to perish without pity and without assistance, as if his crime were inexpiable and his body infectious to the touch. And so Trotter recognizes how alcoholism can both be perceived as a crime and as an infectious disease, even if it's kind of, as if in a kind of simile or metaphorical sense. But to return to Bronte's letter, I also want to propose the possible reading of the sentence, her constitution has triumphed over the hideous disease, in relation to the physical and emotional abuse committed by Mr. Collins against his wife, or perhaps the fact that Mr. Collins is himself this disease. The recurring dashes in the letter merge the sentences so that the appalling distresses narrated by Mrs. Collins become semantically connected to her triumphing over the unknown disease. Bronte is creating here a semantic field. It feels like quite a composed piece, deliberate in its word choice, and therefore perhaps careful in what it wishes to say, especially as this is in relation to intimate violence, and there were certain codes regarding what could and could not be said. The dashes also add to the sense of deliberation, as they give her time to pause and contemplate the next piece of information and how to formulate it for Ellen. And I've highlighted here for this passage the recurring use of words beginning with D, further linking disease with destitution, degradation, and then distress, undeserved, concluding with a more hopeful sense of Mrs. Collins having found a decent place in society. And there's also arguably this kind of subtle echo of cure here in her having procured a respectable place for her and her children beyond the contaminating reach of their father. 7 years beforehand, Mrs. Collins had visited Patrick Bronte, quote, with the most melancholy tale of her wretched husband's drunken, extravagant, profligate habits, unquote. And that was from a letter written by Charlotte Bronte, again to Ellen Nussey, dated the 12th of November, 1840. And in this 1840 letter to Nussey, Charlotte Bronte relates how Mrs. Collins told her father that her husband, quote, treated her and her child savagely, with much more to the same effect, unquote. Patrick tells her, quote, to leave him forever and go home if she had a home to go to, unquote. Mary Taylor, another of Charlotte's close friends, reportedly referred, upon meeting Mr. Collins, to him as a hideous man, which Charlotte quotes in the letter and agrees with. And this is an echo of Bronte's later 1847 letter and description of Mr. Collins as a hideous disease, which Mrs. Collins has to overcome. So both the man and the disease are then aligned in Bronte's letters. And this leads me to conclude that without the unhealthy, contagious presence of her husband, Mrs. Collins's health can recover and she and her children can thrive. In the short story, Janet's Repentance, first published serially in 1857 in Blackwood's magazine, George Eliot even represents intimate violence as a disease that contaminates both the abuser and the survivor in a kind of similar way to Charlotte Bronte in her letter. Robert Dempster is violently abusive towards his wife, Janet Dempster, both physically and emotionally. He is also an alcoholic, and his violence causes Janet to drink. As already mentioned, alcoholism was often perceived as a disease in the period, something requiring a cure or remedy, language that recurs throughout the story. And indeed, Robert is described as being infected with a kind of disease. And here is a scene in which he's walking around the garden with his mother. And the narrator, who is quite a kind of conservative figure, tells us that it was rather sad and yet pretty to see that little group passing out of the shadow into the sunshine, and out of the sunshine into the shadow again. Sad because this tenderness of the son for the mother was hardly more than a nucleus of healthy life in an organ hardening by disease, because the man who was linked in this way with an innocent past had become callous in worldliness, fevered by sensuality, enslaved by chance impulses. And I think this raises the question of what exactly is this disease hardening Robert's organ? Later in the narrative, a possible answer is provided. Cruelty may form the basis of Robert's disease or diseases, a point with which J. Clinton McCann Jr. agrees, as he writes that, quote, Dempster's real disease is that he embodies cruelty and evil. Indeed, the narrator tells us that Robert's cruelty, and I have this here, required no motive outside itself. It only required opportunity. Just as Robert had no motive for drinking beyond the craving for drink, his violence has no motive other than his being an unloving, tyrannous, brutal man who is in the perpetual presence of a woman he can call his own. Robert's craving for drink is equated with his apparent craving for cruelty. And this formulation suggests that just as Robert is addicted to alcohol, just as he has the disease of alcoholism, so too is he addicted to violent cruelty against a woman he can call his own. And so in this sense, cruelty is the disease indeed, hardening the remaining nucleus of healthy life in Robert. As noted, Robert is described as unloving, tyrannous, and brutal. And in 1838, Thomas Mayo's Elements of the Pathology of the Human Mind positions brutality as a, quote, disease of mind itself. Mayo defines the brutal as those with a stern and violent temper who would, if they had sufficient courage, rob, and murder. They have an incapacity for moral distinctions, but do not labour under any suspension of the power of will, and thereby distinguishing them from people suffering from so-called insanity in the period. For Mayo, quote, the state which we term brutality spreads as wide devastation as insanity would, if insanity were left uncontrolled, unquote. And when it comes to violence, in the, quote, absence of the moral feeling, the sufferer of the disease of brutality tends to exculpate themselves in their own mind due to the full and unmitigated influence of resentment, unquote. And so in this formulation, the sufferer of the disease of brutality seems to have no real agency, or at least they have a tendency to claim a lack of responsibility for their violent actions. Mayo's description of the disease of brutality chimes with Eliot's characterization of Robert. And though I have not been able to trace whether Eliot read elements of the pathology of the human mind, she was certainly really interested in psychology and very knowledgeable regarding science. The contemporaneous positioning of brutality as a disease, with violence as a symptom, offers one answer to the question of what disease is gradually reducing the health of Robert Dempster. Several critics have noted how Eliot diverges from common associations of both violence and alcoholism with working class communities through her depiction of middle class marital abuse. And as Lisa Surridge writes, quote, Janet's repentance reverses commonly held Victorian views on cause and effect where alcohol and violence were concerned, suggesting that abuse has caused Janet's drinking rather than vice versa, unquote. In a similar process, the disease of cruelty with which Robert is infected also seems to contaminate Janet, though her symptoms differ from Robert's, so the contamination does not make her more violent or brutal. But the narrator tells us that Janet's troubles had been sinking her lower from year to year, pressing upon her like heavy, fever-laden vapours, and perverting the very plenitude of her nature into a deeper source of disease. Her wretchedness had been a perpetually tightening instrument of torture, which had gradually absorbed all the other sensibilities of her nature into the sense of pain and the maddened craving for relief. The text is slightly vague in terms of what exactly Janet's troubles are. They could be, of course, her alcohol dependency, her soul being, quote, kept like a vexed sea, unquote, or Robert's abuse of her. Her mornings are described elsewhere as feverish, which was often associated with delirium tremens in the period, and could be the result of having imbibed too much alcohol the night before. Later, when Robert has died following a crash in his gig while under the influence of alcohol, Janet's doctor, Mr. Pilgrim, and Mrs. Loam, who Janet had nursed during an illness, discuss Janet's habits, of which Mrs. Loam thinks, quote, she should cure herself before pretending to be over-religious, unquote. As Pilgrim notes, however, since her husband's death, Janet has avoided alcohol, underscoring the fact that her reliance on it was caused by her husband's abuse. It may also be that this disease, of course, is not literal, but one of dis-ease, when the body registers uneasiness. And in this passage as well, disease itself, whether medical or metaphorical, is figured as a form of violence wrought on the body. So her wretchedness, which is the source of disease, becomes a perpetually tightening instrument of torture. Notably, it's the very plenitude of Janet's nature that is distorted into a deeper source of disease. This initially seems to suggest that Robert is not the source of disease. It comes from Janet herself. But more specifically, the perversion of her nature by her troubles is the source of the disease. The source of her troubles, of course, is Robert, who is represented, as I've argued, as having two diseases of the period, alcoholism and brutality. The wretchedness caused by Robert and his violence absorbs Janet's other sensibilities and spreads through her body. And she hopes for relief in the form of, as referenced earlier in the narrative, quote, purification and inward peace, unquote. And I find it striking that Janet, as a survivor of intimate violence, is also described as a carrier of disease here. This disease is not necessarily contagious in that her disease is not kind of mirror image of Robert. It's not that they've kind of the close contact and she now has a disease of brutality, but contamination of some sort has occurred. And perhaps Janet's disease is also of another kind, a moral contagion contracted through close contact with her husband, who is, as mentioned, cruel and evil. Janet's eventual cure from both her intemperance and her wretchedness comes in the form of Mr. Tryon, the evangelical curate in whom Janet finds solace during the late stages of her husband's violence and in the aftermath of his death. Early in the short story, the conservative narrator positions evangelicalism itself as a disease that had invaded Milby Parish. In this sense, in curing herself of two diseases, both alcohol dependency on the one hand and the contaminating effects of Robert's disease of brutality on the other, Janet is then infected seemingly by evangelicalism by the story's end. Or perhaps it's more so that Janet is cured of her other diseases through the invasion of a different kind of disease, one which does not pervert the plenitude of her nature. Rather, it may give her the purification she so desires. The pathologization of marital abuse is evident in other sources of the period, such as Frances Power Cobb's Wife Torture in England from 1878, notably written when contagious approaches to disease were more dominant. Cobb seeks to outline the, quote, possible remedy, unquote, of marital abuse, arguing that in order for a remedy to be found for wife torture, quote, the immediate causes of the offence of brutal violence need to be better understood than they commonly are, unquote. And remedy had a variety of meanings in the period, including the counteracting of sin, legal redress, and the curing of disease. And indeed, Cobb later reveals that the primary remedy that she has in mind is judicial separation, to which wealthier women have recourse, but from which women with lower incomes, including many middle-class women, rarely find solace. In this sense, there is some semantic slippage in terms of what the remedy might mean or might be. Cobb elsewhere refers to the hope of finding some palliative for the second kind of wife beating, that is, quote, when the man alone is a striker and the woman the stricken, unquote. The word palliative is more straightforwardly medical in its meaning, as it refers to a treatment that gives relief, mitigating pain, disease, or suffering. Notably, Cobb does not specify whom the palliative or remedy is for. Perhaps most likely it's in reference to the abusive partner, but it's not entirely clear from Cobb's essay. Regardless, Cobb is evidently interested in adopting a language of pathology in her discussion of intimate violence. So to come to a kind of conclusion here, Bronte's letter, Janet's repentance, and Frances Power Cobb's Wife Torture point to the proximity between disease and intimate violence in the 19th century, its pathologization, and its representation as something capable of contaminating not only the abuser, but also the victim survivor. This final suggestion that victim survivors may themselves take on the diseases, or at least a disease, given to them by their abusers, namely alcoholism, venereal disease, brutality, and perhaps another less literal, more kind of nebulous one of maybe moral contagion, plays into shifting notions of individual responsibility and moral duty in the 19th century. Apart from Cobb's article, which often characterizes working class women as active participants in their own abuse, Bronte's letter and Eliot's short story do not blame victim survivors. Indeed, their characterization of the intimate violence, either as a disease or at least akin to notions of disease in the period, argues, I believe, for the opposite, that these women are not responsible for their partner's violence, yet they're still in need of a cure, having been tainted by abuse in some way. In this sense, such writers preempt not only later 19th century understandings of disease in terms of contagionism, but also ongoing attempts to consider violence as a major public health crisis, both proving their prescience and the really rather bleak reality that the disease of intimate violence is nothing new and was indeed being theorized and examined, however obliquely, by 19th century British women writers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your articulate, fascinating, and very illuminating presentation. Now I would like to stop recording.